Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're diving into an emotional new chapter as the CEO returns to the village, hoping Tieu Lac can help him recover the family memories he has lost. But when his daughter runs into his arms crying, "Papa," something buried deep inside him suddenly begins to awaken. Will he finally remember the family he once loved? And what will happen when the truth about his mother begins to surface? Stay with us until the end to find out. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The village was unusually quiet that morning. The sun had only recently risen above the hills, spreading a soft golden light across the strawberry fields. Tieu Lac was already outside, carefully sorting freshly picked strawberries into small baskets. Her daughter was still inside the house, and for once the morning felt peaceful. Then the sound of a car engine came from the narrow road. At first, Tieu Lac didn't pay much attention. Visitors sometimes came to the village, especially during harvest season. But the sound grew closer. A black car slowly appeared at the end of the road. The moment Tieu Lac recognized it, her hands stopped moving. The car pulled up directly in front of her house. For several seconds, nobody got out. Tieu Lac simply stood there, staring. Then the driver's door opened. The CEO stepped out. He wasn't wearing the expensive suit she was used to seeing him in. There was no assistant beside him, no driver, and no group of employees following him. He had come alone. In one hand, he carried an old brown envelope. Tieu Lac's expression immediately became cold. "What are you doing here?" The CEO closed the car door. "I need to talk to you." "We have nothing to talk about." She turned back toward the baskets. But he didn't leave. "Tieu Lac." Hearing him call her name made her pause. There had once been a time when hearing that voice could make her heart race. Now it only reminded her of everything she had lost. "I came here because I found something." She slowly turned around. The CEO opened the brown envelope and pulled out several old photographs. The first showed the two of them standing beside a strawberry field. The second showed him carrying baskets, while Tieu Lac laughed beside him. Another showed them eating together inside the small village house. There were more. Photographs of moments he couldn't remember. The CEO looked down at them. "I've been looking at these for days." Tieu Lac said nothing. "Everyone around me keeps telling me different things about my past. My mother says one thing. Other people say something else." He held up one of the photographs. "But these don't lie." Tieu Lac's eyes moved toward the picture. She remembered that day. She remembered what they had eaten. She remembered what he had whispered to her when the photograph was taken. And somehow, knowing that she remembered everything while he remembered nothing, hurt even more. The CEO stepped closer. "I came here before, didn't I?" Tieu Lac remained silent. "I stayed in this village." Still nothing. "I knew your family." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the strawberry basket. Finally, he asked the question that had been haunting him. "Were we really in love?" Tieu Lac looked directly into his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she gave him a bitter smile. "Why are you asking me?" "Because you're the only person who can tell me the truth." "No." The CEO frowned. "What?" "I won't tell you." He clearly hadn't expected that answer. "Tieu Lac, please." She turned away. "I didn't drive all the way here to argue with you." "Then you should turn around and drive back." "I can't." That answer made her stop. The CEO reached into the envelope again. This time, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn. When he opened it, Tieu Lac immediately recognized it. It was a child's drawing. 3 people stood underneath a huge yellow sun. A little girl was in the middle, holding the hands of a man and a woman. Above them were several uneven words written by a child: "Papa, Mama, and me." Tieu Lac's face changed. "Where did you get that?" "I found it with my old things." The CEO stared at the drawing. I don't remember when she drew it. I don't even remember seeing it before. His voice became quieter. But every time I look at it, something feels wrong. Tieu Lac said nothing. I feel like I'm looking at a life that belongs to me, but I can't enter it. For the first time, pain appeared openly on his face. That's why I need you to tell me everything. Tieu Lac slowly shook her head. No. Why? Because I already lived through everything once. Her voice was still controlled, but he could hear the emotion underneath it. I lived through meeting you. I lived through trusting you. I lived through loving you. The CEO froze. I lived through waiting for you when you were busy. I lived through every argument, every promise, every time you left this village, and every time you came back. Her eyes began to shine. And then I lived through losing you. The CEO lowered his voice. I didn't choose to lose my memory. I know. That answer surprised him. Tieu Lac looked directly at him. Do you really think I'm angry because you forgot me? He hesitated. Then what is it? She took a deep breath. The thing that hurts me most isn't that you forgot our relationship. Her voice trembled. It isn't that you forgot this village. She paused. It isn't even that you forgot me. The CEO stared at her. Tieu Lac's eyes filled with tears. What hurt me most was watching our daughter recognize her father. He immediately remembered that day. The little girl running toward him, her tiny arms wrapping around his leg, that excited voice shouting one word, Papa. And watching you push her away. His face went pale. Tieu Lac, she waited for you. Her voice finally broke, every single day. The CEO couldn't move. She asked when Papa was coming home. She drew pictures of you. She talked about you before going to sleep. Whenever she heard a car outside, she would run to the door because she thought maybe you had finally returned. A tear rolled down Tieu Lac's cheek, and when you finally stood in front of her, you looked at your own daughter like she was a stranger. I didn't know. I know you didn't know. Her voice suddenly rose, but she didn't understand that. The CEO fell silent. That was the truth he had been avoiding. He had been confused. He had been frightened. But the little girl hadn't known any of that. All she knew was that her father had pushed her away. I'm sorry. Tieu Lac wiped away her tears. Don't apologize to me. Then what am I supposed to do? I don't know. The answer was painfully honest. I don't know if there is anything you can do. Suddenly, the quiet between them was broken by the sound of the front door opening. Small footsteps came from inside the house. Mama! Both of them turned. Their daughter appeared at the doorway, still sleepy, holding a small toy in one hand. She looked at Tieu Lac. Then she noticed the black car. Her eyes widened. Finally, she saw the man standing beside it. The toy slipped from her hand. For 1 second, the little girl stood completely still. Then her entire face lit up. Papa! The CEO's heart seemed to stop. She ran toward him. Tieu Lac instinctively reached out. Wait! But it was too late. The little girl rushed across the yard and wrapped both arms around his legs. Papa! Papa came back. The CEO looked down at her. His hands began to tremble. This was the same child he had pushed away before. But this time, something inside him wouldn't allow him to move back. Slowly, he knelt in front of her. The girl immediately threw her arms around his neck. And this time, the CEO held his daughter tightly. His eyes closed. He couldn't remember her birth. He couldn't remember her first steps. He couldn't remember the first time she called him Papa. But as he held her in his arms, an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. Then, without warning, a blurred image flashed through his mind. A baby's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. A woman's laughter. Tieu Lac's voice, and a promise he could no longer fully hear. The CEO suddenly opened his eyes. What had he just remembered? The CEO remained completely still. His daughter was still holding tightly around his neck, but his mind was somewhere else. That image had lasted less than a second. A tiny hand, a baby's fingers wrapped around his own, Tieu Lac's voice somewhere nearby, and laughter, his laughter. It was gone before he could understand it. But for the first time since losing his memory, the past hadn't come to him through a photograph or someone else's story. It had come from inside him. "Papa?" His daughter's voice pulled him back. The CEO looked at her. She touched his face with both hands. "Why are you crying?" Only then did he realize tears were running down his cheeks. He quickly wiped them away. "I'm okay." The little girl studied him seriously. "Did someone hurt you?" The question made Tieu Lac look away. The CEO forced a small smile. "No." "Then why didn't you come home?" His smile disappeared. That simple question was more difficult than anything he had faced in the company. He could negotiate contracts worth millions. He could stand in front of hundreds of employees. But he couldn't explain to his own daughter why he had forgotten she existed. He paused. "Papa got lost." The girl frowned. "Lost?" "Yes." "So you couldn't find our house?" The CEO looked toward Tieu Lac. She stood silently near the strawberry baskets. "No," he said softly. "I couldn't find my way back." The little girl immediately pointed toward the house. "It's right there." For a moment, he almost laughed. "Yes." She smiled proudly. "Now you know." The CEO pulled her into his arms again. "Now I know." Tieu Lac watched from a distance. Part of her wanted to take her daughter away. She was afraid. Not because she believed the CEO would intentionally hurt the child, but because she knew how quickly hope could become pain. Her daughter had already lost her father once. Tieu Lac didn't know if she could watch it happen again. A few minutes later, she walked toward them. "Come inside. You haven't eaten breakfast." The girl shook her head and tightened her arms around the CEO. "I want Papa." Tieu Lac sighed. "You can see him later." The CEO slowly stood. Actually, he wasn't sure there would be a later. That thought frightened him. "Tieu Lac." She looked at him. "I want to stay." Her expression immediately changed. "No." "Just for a few days." "No." "I think being here might help my memory." "That's your problem." "I know." He glanced around. The strawberry fields, the narrow road, the old house. Even the smell of the morning air felt strangely familiar. "When I held her just now, I saw something." Tieu Lac froze. "What did you see?" "A baby's hand holding my finger." Her eyes widened slightly. "And I heard you." "What did I say?" "I don't know. It disappeared too quickly." Tieu Lac's face softened for only a second before becoming guarded again. The CEO noticed. "That really happened, didn't it?" She didn't answer. "Tieu Lac, please." "You said you wanted your memories back." "Yes." "Then remember them yourself." He stared at her. She continued. "If I tell you everything, how will you know what's real and what you're simply imagining? Because I told you." He had no answer. Tieu Lac was right. He looked toward the fields again. "That's exactly why I want to stay." She shook her head. "You can't suddenly return, and act like this is some place where you can recover for a few days. I'm not treating it that way." "Then what are you doing?" "Trying to understand who I was." Tieu Lac laughed bitterly. "You want to know who you were?" She stepped closer. "You were someone our daughter trusted completely." His expression changed. "You were the man she waited for." Then Tieu Lac pointed toward the house. "And now she finally has you standing here again. What happens when 3 days are over? What happens when your company calls? What happens when your mother tells you to return?" The CEO stayed silent. "What do I tell her when Papa disappears again?" Those words hit him hard. "I won't hurt her." "You already did." The CEO lowered his eyes. Tieu Lac immediately regretted saying it so harshly, but she couldn't take it back. Because it was true. Before either of them could say anything else, their daughter suddenly ran between them. No. She wrapped both arms around the CEO's waist. Papa doesn't go. Tieu Lac crouched beside her. Come here. The girl shook her head. No. Papa has work. Papa stays here. Her voice began trembling. The CEO looked down at her tiny hands gripping his shirt. Something about that movement struck him. Another flash. Rain. A suitcase. A little girl crying, his own hand touching her head. Then a voice. I'll come back. The CEO suddenly grabbed his temple. Tieu Lac noticed immediately. What's wrong? I saw something again. What? He looked at his daughter. I promised her I would come back. Tieu Lac went silent. That memory was real. Before everything fell apart, he had made exactly that promise. The CEO slowly knelt beside his daughter. Do you remember Papa saying that? The little girl nodded. You said you'd come back soon. His eyes filled with guilt. And I didn't. She shook her head. But you're here now. 4 simple words. No anger. No accusation. Only happiness. The CEO couldn't speak. Tieu Lac turned away because she knew if she kept watching, she might cry again. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke. 3 days. The CEO looked up. What? You can stay in the village for 3 days. Their daughter immediately smiled. Really? Tieu Lac pointed at the CEO. But there are conditions. He stood. Tell me. You don't force me to talk about our past. He nodded. You don't interfere with my work. Okay. And you don't take our daughter anywhere without telling me. Of course. Tieu Lac hesitated before adding the most important condition. And don't promise her anything you can't keep. The CEO's expression became serious. I promise. Tieu Lac stared at him. For several seconds there was silence. Then she raised an eyebrow. You just broke the rule. He realized what he had said. Their daughter burst out laughing. Even Tieu Lac couldn't completely hide the tiny smile at the corner of her mouth. The CEO looked at her. For one brief moment, something about that smile felt familiar. Very familiar. Another image almost surfaced. Tieu Lac standing beneath the afternoon sun. Strawberry leaves behind her. That same smile. But before he could catch it, the memory disappeared again. This time, however, he didn't panic. Maybe memories couldn't be forced. Maybe they had to return one piece at a time. Their daughter grabbed his hand. Papa, come. Where? I'll show you our house. The CEO smiled. I think I've seen it before. No, I'll show you everything. She pulled him toward the door. He took only 2 steps before stopping and looking back at Tieu Lac. She remained where she was. 3 days, she reminded him. He nodded. 3 days. But as he followed his daughter into the small house, none of them noticed a car parked far down the road. Inside, a man was watching. He raised his phone. The CEO is here. A woman's voice answered from the other end. Are you sure? Yes, he's staying with Tieu Lac. There was a long silence. Then the woman spoke again. It was the CEO's mother. Don't let him remember too much. The man looked toward the house. What do you want me to do? Her voice became cold. If that village is bringing his memories back. She paused. Then give him a reason to leave. The call ended. Meanwhile, inside the house, the CEO stood in front of an old family photograph hanging on the wall. Tieu Lac, their daughter, and himself. He slowly reached out and touched the photograph. Then another memory flashed through his mind. This one was clearer. His mother was standing in front of him. Tieu Lac was crying somewhere behind her. And his mother's voice echoed inside his head. Choose your family. Or choose her. The CEO stepped backward in shock. For the first time, he realized something terrifying. Maybe his mother hadn't simply hidden his past. Maybe she had been trying to separate him from Tieu Lac long before he ever lost his memory. The CEO returns to Tieu Lac's village, carrying old photographs and a drawing made by their daughter, hoping these fragments of the past will help him understand the life he has forgotten. He asks Tieu Lac to reveal everything about their relationship, but she refuses. Her deepest pain is not that he lost his memory, but that he once pushed away his own daughter when she ran toward him calling Papa. When the little girl sees him again, she rushes into his arms, awakening emotional flashes of forgotten memories. Desperate to recover more, the CEO asks to remain in the village for several days. Tieu Lac reluctantly agrees after their daughter begs him to stay. But as his memories slowly return, a hidden threat emerges. His mother learns where he is and secretly orders someone to make him leave before he discovers the truth about their past.